Hey everybody, this is Burke Holland and welcome back to HTML5 development for ASP.NET developers. This is part 2 of the Hello Kendo UI module. We've got a lot to do today, so let's hop over to Visual Studio and get started. If you remember from last time, we had created a Kendo UI grid and wired that up to the employees table in the Northwind database. And then we configured the grid and the server to do the paging on the server, which was nice. And we can page through these records and the server will respond, and the paging is actually being done server side instead of client side. Today we're going to take this a step further and add editing to this grid and see how we can do full CRUD operations with the Kendo UI grid and WebAPI. So let's have a look at how we do that. The first thing that I want to do is I want to add some more information to the employees object. I'm going to go ahead and add the title, city, and birth date fields from the database. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a constructor here in this model object that's actually going to take in the link to SQL object and do the mapping for me here in this object, so I'm not doing it in the controller anymore, as that logic doesn't really belong there. So I'll create a constructor here, and then inside of the constructor I'm just going to pass in an instance of this employee object, and then I'll go ahead and do the mapping here. There we go. And then I just need to remove this logic here, the mapping logic, from the controller, since we've moved this logic into the model object itself. And that looks a lot cleaner, and you can see that the get method is now composed primarily of comments. So let's go ahead and save this, and we will go ahead and fire up the application here and have a look. You can see the grid still has 2 comments in it. If we go ahead and open up the developer tools and look at the network tab here, and I'll refresh so we can capture some requests, and look at the employees API, you can see that we're sending in the title and the city, but they're not showing up in the grid. So we need to go ahead and add those columns. In the default.aspx page, and let me increase the font size here to make this a little bit easier to see. There we go, that's a big improvement. I'll go ahead and move these things out of the way. We just need to add in these columns. So I'm going to add in the title column, and because the column header and the field are the same thing, I can just specify the string. Same goes for city. And on the birth date, we'll specify the field and we'll make the title birthday. I'm going to save this and we'll have a look here at our grid. Close out the developer tools for now and refresh the page. So there we go. We're pulling all of the columns from the database into the grid, all of the ones that we specified. And now we want to be able to enable editing in this grid. Now to do that, I can actually just come down here, and on the grid I can say that editable is true. If I make this change and we have a look at the application, refresh here, and you see that when I click on columns, they become editable. This is the default. But this is not exactly what we want. The date is actually a string and it's not really formatted correctly, and we don't want people to be able to change their first name, as that's highly unlikely. So let's go ahead and define a model for the data source that will help us to specify some validation rules and then which of these fields are in fact editable. So down here in the schema, underneath the total here, I'm going to add a model definition. And the model object is going to need a couple of pieces of information. Specifically, it needs to know which field is the primary key for the grid, and in our case that's the ID. And then the second thing that it needs to know is, on the fields, are there any specific rules that we have for the fields? And in fact there are. So for the first name field, we actually want it to be required. So for validation, we can pass in required is true, like that. And then we also want nullable to be false. We don't want them to be able to null out the value in the grid. And let's go ahead and add the same sort of thing for the last name. And then we'll finish out the rest of the columns. There we go, we finished with all the columns, and I do want to make one change, and instead of validating the first name, it'd actually be easier for us if we just said that it was not editable. So I can say editable is false. So let's go ahead and save this and come back to the grid here. So if I click on the first name column, you see that I can't edit this, which is what we want. And on the last name, if I completely null it out, it will not let me proceed, but tell me that the last name is required. So put that back. And then on the birth date column, we're still getting a string. And what we would like instead is a date picker, and we would like to clean this date up some. So the way that we do that is on the birth date field here, we need to specify a type. And we can say that the type is date. And that will give us a date picker. However, we still need to specify the format of the birth date, the way we want it displayed. And we're going to do that in the column definition. So I'm going to come here and just say that the format is going to be the month, day, and then 4-digit year format. There we go. And close that off. And if we save all of these changes and then come back over and have a look at the application, refreshing, you can see that the date is now formatted very nicely, just the way we want it. And when we click on it, we get a nice date picker. So this is really nice. However, I want to use command columns in Kendo UI's grid, which are really nice. They're built in, instead of this inline editing. So let's make that change. We're going to add a column, and we're going to say that the command that we have is edit. Actually, command is an array. We have edit, and we have destroy. And then we're going to say that the title for this column is nothing, because we don't need to display anything in the column header. There we go. So go ahead and save this. And in the app, if we have a look, you can refresh. And we now have edit and delete buttons, but you can see while the delete button does fire an event, the edit button does not. And that's because we need to make a small change, and that is that we need to tell Kendo UI that the editing is in line, and we can do that right here. And just save that. With that change, back in the grid, when I click edit, it will put the entire row into edit mode. And it does. It's just really nice. And we still have all of our validation and our custom date picker. But nothing is really wired up to the database yet. So when I click update, while it looks like it made a change, it actually did not, because it hasn't been wired to the server. So let's go ahead and add our update command to the server side. Before we can really do that, though, we need to specify for Kendo UI how we're going to do the update. And that's done on the transport. So we can say that the update is going to be, and we need to define the URL that we're going to call, and then the HTTP method that we want to use to do that. And that's going to be a post. And this is typical for updates. Now the URL I'm actually going to set to a function, and I'm going to expect the function to get an employee object. And Kendo UI will automatically take care of passing this in for us. Every time the update is called, it takes the current model object and passes that into the function. So then I can construct a custom URL and say, well, return the API employees, and then go ahead and append the employee.id right on the end there. And this will return a custom URL for us that we can use to make the update. So we go ahead and close this off. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop the project, and we need to go back to the employees controller and add in the ability to do a post. We don't have a post method just yet. So let me hide this. Underneath the get, come down here, and just above the delete that's left over from the Hello Services module, we're going to create a post method, and we just call it post. And for right now, we'll just make this void so we can get the definition in here. There we go. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can communicate with Kendo UI that we've had a successful or an unsuccessful post transaction on the server. And the way that I'm going to do it is with an HTTP response message. There we go. And the response message will return a 200 OK if everything happened okay, and if something went wrong, it's going to return an internal server error with a little bit more information about what actually went wrong. So let's go ahead and declare a response up top that's generic that we can send back. So we'll just say that we have a response, and it's a new HTTP response message. There we go. And we don't have to pass anything into the constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little try catch here. And we'll select the employee to update from the database based on its ID. In order to do that, we need to pass in the ID to the post. And if you remember from the routing, we can call the employees endpoint API/employees, or we can call API/employees/an ID and pass the ID in. It's optional. So we'll go ahead and use that here. And then we will select from the context where we have a matching ID. Now that should give us an employee back from the database, and we're going to select the first or default record. But just in the off chance that we have requested to update an employee that doesn't exist, we're going to check and make sure that employee to update is not equal to null. There we go. And if it is equal to null, then we'll go ahead and say that this employee does not exist. And to do that, we're going to say that the response status code is a new status code, and we'll say that it's an internal server error. There we go. And then we're going to say in the response that the content is a new string content, and we're just going to do a little string formatting here, and we'll say that the employee with ID whatever was not found in the database. There we go. Let's see if we can close up all these parentheses correctly, and we'll need a constructor here. Okay, there we go. So that's returning the correct response message. If we do have it, we actually want to update the fields that we're passing in. We also need to check to make sure that they're not null, because we don't want to update if somebody sent in an empty string. We cannot require or depend on the browser to do the validation and assume that the data is completely intact. So what we'll do is we'll say that for each of these fields here, we'll check for the last name, and we'll check to see if the request has a last name field on it. And we're actually going to check to see if it's null or empty, because if it's an empty string or a null value, we don't want to accept it off of the request. So if this is the case, then we're just going to set it to itself. And if it's not the case, then we'll set it to the last name coming in off of the request. And I need to modify this just slightly here to use the global request object that we defined above. And this request object, if you don't recall, is defined at the top of the file, and it is set to the context and the current HTTP request. So we're just looking at parameters that are sent from the server. So let's go ahead and handle the rest of the fields that are coming across in the request the same way. There we go. We've got all the fields mapped in, and I'm converting the birth date to a date time if it is in fact not a null or empty string value. The last thing that we need to do is we need to handle the catch here. So we'll say in the catch, we're going to catch a generic exception, and you can catch more specific exceptions if you like. And we'll set the status code equal to a internal server error. There we go. And then we'll set the content, and we'll give it a little bit more information here. And we will pass back the error to the browser here. All right, there we go. We'll go ahead and close that off. All right, there we go. So let's go ahead and save and run this and have a look at what our grid does now. So I can put this row into edit mode now, simply by clicking the edit button, and I can change a value and then submit that to the server. I'm going to click update, and then we'll refresh, and if you notice, the update did not take. Well, there's a good reason for that. If we bring up the network tools here, and I'm just going to start capturing, and then click edit, and I go back and make this change again and click update, you'll see that the request returns a 500 internal server error. So if we click on it, we can get some more information. There was an error updating employee 1. The string was not recognized as a valid date time. So this is the error message that we put in. And let's take a look at the date time that we're actually sending to the server. So we're actually sending this right here, which .NET is not going to be able to serialize into a valid date time. The reason for this is that dates and times are tricky, and we need to get them out of JavaScript and into a format that ASP.NET or .NET on the server can understand. And we're going to do that using the parameter map function on the data source. So that you don't have to watch me type this out, I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in right here in the transport, right below the update here. I'm going to paste in the parameter map, and we'll talk about what all this means. The parameter map is what the data source evaluates right before it sends the parameters to the server. So if you wanted to actually modify the parameters, you would do that here in this operation and then return them. It takes in two variables, an options and an operation. The options contains the variables that are about to be sent in the AJAX request, and the operation is either the create, read, update, or destroy. So in this case, we're going to look to see if it's an update, and if it is, then we need to create a new JavaScript date using the birth date value, and then using the Kendo.toString, we're going to format it to send back to the server in a format that .NET can understand and serialize. And whenever you use the parameter map, you always need to return options out of the parameter map. If you don't, then you will end up sending no parameters to the server, and you will wonder what happens to them. So with this change in place, I'm going to click Save, and we'll come back and refresh the application, and we'll try this change again. We'll take the E off here and click Update, and you can see that this time we got a 200. Everything was okay, and if I refresh, you can see that the change is persisted into the database, and when we check out the response from the server, I'll click Update. You can see that everything is coming back okay. We don't have a response sent back, but we do have a 200 okay. So let's go ahead and wire up the delete as well. The delete is actually a much more simple operation, as we're just going to remove the record. So in the default.aspx, right below the update, we'll just create a destroy. And we use the destroy because delete is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. And just like with the update, we're going to create a function that takes in an employee value that will be passed by the data source automatically. And then we will just return the specific URL with the employee ID attached on the end. And we'll specify that the type on this request is a delete. And there we are. And save this. And the other thing that I want to show you is that there is more than one way to return an error to the UI. The other thing that we can do is simply return an errors field with our response. So if you remember, we have this generic response object here, and I can actually create another property here that we'll call errors. And then I'm going to create a constructor here that doesn't do anything but set the value of the errors property by taking in an error string and then setting that here to the errors variable that was passed in. There we go. And then I'm going to create a constructor that doesn't take in anything at all. We'll go ahead and save this. And on the employees controller, in the delete method here, what we're going to do instead is we're going to do a try catch on the existing delete here. So we'll wrap this and then put a catch here, catch the exception. And what we'll do is return a response, and we'll set an error if there is one. So I'll just say return new models, not response, and this will be an empty response if the action and delete happen successfully, and it'll just return a 200 OK. On the exception, what we're going to do is we're going to return a new models response, and we will return an error instead by using the constructor overload right here. All right, so there we have it, and we just need to change the return type here to be models response. And we're good to go. Now, back in the default.aspx page, we do need to specify the errors portion of the model. So right here, below the model, we're just going to say that the errors is equal to the errors field on the object coming back. And what's going to happen here is that if this value is present, the data source is actually going to raise an event called the error event. So right here we can say below this error, and we'll have a function, and this function will take in an error object when it actually does error, and we can actually take some action. For right now, we will console out and have a look at what E is so we can know exactly how to handle the error. So now that we've made all of these changes, we'll run the application and check out how a delete functions using the errors field to send back the response. That's something did not happen okay. I'm going to pull up the developer tools, and we'll come over here to the network tab and look at our requests, and then I'll go ahead and click delete, and it will prompt me, and I'll say OK, and you can see that it fired and we got a 200 back. And if we come back over here to the console, you'll see that the event was fired, the error event, and it wrote out this error object so we can see exactly what happened. And here's our error: unable to delete employee 1. Now, this is not information that you would want to expose to your user, so better to log this somewhere on the database and give the user a very user-friendly error. They just can know that the delete failed because Nancy has relationships in the orders table as well. But we do still have a problem. If you'll notice, the grid removed the row, and that's because the data source is aware that this delete did not succeed, but it's not really sure what to do with it until you tell it what to do. So right now it's holding this object as dirty, and it's waiting for things to be fixed so that it can try again. So at this point, the best thing to do would be for us to log the error and roll back the delete in the grid so that it doesn't go away, and maybe give the user a user-friendly error. So here in the error function, instead of logging this out, let's just go ahead and alert the user and say that the delete failed here, and then we'll say we'll tell the data source that we want to cancel the changes. So it knows the object's dirty, and we're going to set the object as clean and discard, roll back any changes that we've made, which will put the row back into the grid. So I'll save this, and let's refresh, and we'll try our delete again, and this time it says that delete failed, and we click OK, and then you can see that the grid rolls back and puts the row back in and marks it as clean again. And that's more of the response that we want in a grid. Otherwise, it looks like the delete succeeded when it actually didn't. So this has been Grid CRUD, Part 2 of Hello Kendo UI. Come back next week. We're going to take a look at some of the other widgets in Kendo UI and continue to build out this application using HTML5. Talk to you next time.